Hi, everyone. Warm welcome to all of you, especially on a Friday almost evening, last day of the conference. We are really, really grateful that you're joining us today for this interesting and timely discussion that we are going to have about illicit financial flows. So, again, Friday evening, let me start by asking a question. If I could give you today $10.7 billion, how would you spend it? And I don't know about you guys, but in my case, I think that I would probably like to go on holidays, buy properties, and many other things. And the truth is that every time what we see is that the money that goes through financial centers that is often taken from countries and citizens that can afford it ends up being spent this way. Luxury properties, cars, expensive vacations, and I could continue to add things. I don't have $10.7 billion to give you, but we are going to be discussing here today with this amazing panelist. Let me start by introducing Alex Gillis. Hope I had pronounced it well, your surname, from the OCCRP. She's the executive director. Enrique Visser from the Century. Ivana Rossi from the International Monetary Funds, senior financial sector expert, and Andres Nobel from the Tax Justice Network, who leads the work on beneficial ownership transparency in the institution. My name is Emilia Berasategui. I am Senior Communication Officer at the IMF and will be moderating today's discussion. Going back to the $10.7 billion, and before I kick off the conversation today, I want to be very clear that this is not a figure that I came up with or that I invented. Actually, $10.7 billion is what the African Development Bank estimated that is lost in the period 2000 and 2008 in Nigeria due to illicit financial flows. So just think what this money could make in Nigeria at the national level. I'm really keen to hear from our panelists here today. And let me start with one question that I think that we are all wondering about, and is, while there are some estimates of the magnitude of illicit financial flows, would you say that we have a good understanding of illicit financial flows, impact in countries, including on the macroeconomy? How could we strengthen our understanding, actually, of the illicit financial flows consequences? And do you think that these consequences are similar in all the countries? And I don't know, maybe, Enrique, if you would like us to kick off with your thoughts on this, and then I will take also comments from the rest of the speakers. And at the end, we would also be opening the floor for your questions and comments. We are really, really looking forward to that as well. Enrique?
Thank you, Emilia. Yes, what is the macroeconomic impact of illicit financial flows? I think it is a lot bigger than we know. Of course, data on IFFs is hard to come by. Even though we made some steps, we now defined illicit financial flows. The UN is starting to collect official data. But I think still we are only scratching the surface. For example, we at the Century investigate kleptocracy, corruption, and illicit financial flows related to human rights abuses and conflict. And if you only look at the impact of conflict on GDP, we're not even talking about the impact of organized crime or drugs trafficking or human trafficking. Just on conflict, we see that already right after a conflict breaks out, GDP is impacted by 15%. And this is not my research, this is IMF research. So I'm just copying your data. And then even 10 years after the conflict, on average, the GDP has lowered 28% if you add everything. So I think just if we look at the drivers of conflict and the impact, it's massively related to illicit financial flows.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Ivan, I don't know if there is something else that you would like to add on this first question.
Yes, thank you so much. So the IMF has been working on the issue of financial integrity and illicit financial flows in an evolving manner for over 20 years now. And we very recently came out with a paper focused on illicit financial flows because we think we don't understand enough, all of us, and I'm saying we as a collective. We all know about illicit financial flows. We all agree they're bad. But when we really start scratching that surface, as you were saying, we think there's still a lot more to be understood. And one of the main takeaways of that paper that we published in December, it's on our website, is that we have to start understanding the impact and the macroeconomic impact, but also by the type of country and the role that country has in the illicit financial flows chain, to call it somehow. It's not the same impact at the source country, which is the one that has been more understood so far, than the transit or destination. And if I can take a minute to explain what I'm trying to say, is if you're a source or originator country, generally these are the low-income, fragile conflict states or countries that have a lot of crimes or financial crimes, tax evasion, corruption, or organized crime, high activity of organized crime. These are the typical countries that are generating these illicit financial flows. And I think there's a lot of knowledge in this area about how it impacts revenue mobilization, investment in the country, development efforts. We know that it has impact across the economy and the development of the country. I would say that originator countries are the ones that have been most studied in terms of the impact of illicit financial flows and the macroeconomic impact of it. What we are trying to argue in this paper, and here today I hope to bring to the discussion, is we need to understand more also that transit countries, which in the short term seem to benefit from those illicit financial flows because they have favorable tax regimes to attract them, financial secrecy laws that help those funds transit, professional services, also sometimes we call them enablers. It seems like they're benefiting economically from having these financial flows transit through their financial system. But we also think there are long-term consequences because these countries then, because of their non-compliance with international standards, they get grey-listed, or they have correspondent banking relationship issues, reputational issues that do impact the economy of the country. So maybe short-term there seems to be benefits, but long-term that's not necessarily the case. And the same for destination countries being typically the more advanced financial centers in which the funds are integrated and are very now far away from the original crimes. So they've been layered, and now they're completely integrated to the economy, so it's much harder to relate them to the originating crime. And it seems like, oh, well, this money is flowing in and nothing happens. But now, when we look at it, it actually has consequences for those countries too. You can have distortions in the banking sector. You can have distortions in the real estate market and having an affordable housing because dirty money is buying all the real estate. I think this is something that has been reported quite a bit. So just to summarize, we think that we need to understand a lot more what the impact is, and we're trying to work on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And talking about understanding the impact, Alex, I know that you with OCCRP, you're doing a great work with civil society, investigative journalists, actually helping everyone to better understand this. So I don't know if you have any reflections on this first question that you would like to share with us.
Great. Thanks very much. Just quickly, my boss would want me to clarify that I'm not actually the executive director of OCCRP unless I received a promotion while at this conference.
You should be promoted.
Yes.
Sorry, my bad.
But I lead a program called the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which works to expand the impact of investigative reporting and make sure that it's feeding into policy reform and law enforcement activity by partnering with civil society. And through that work, it's clear OCCRP is a global network of investigative journalists. And investigative journalists are great at revealing kind of the micro case studies of how this works, of how illicit financial flows work, and also the harms that they cause. I do think it's very important for institutions like the IMF and others to look at the more macro harms that illicit financial flows have. Not just in terms of different economic effects, but political effects, social effects, environmental effects, conflict effects. There's a lot out there. And I think the more we appreciate and understand that, especially when we're talking to audiences not choosing to go to an anti-corruption conference, having that analytical ammunition is really important. I do think there are two, along with kind of the overall scale, two areas for improvement. One, I was going to make the same point you did, is understanding the impact economically of illicit financial flows on the transit countries, on the jurisdictions that have chosen to lean towards illicit financial flows instead of leaning away from them. I think domestically in particular, countries where secrecy is for sale, where professionals who engage in enabling activity tend to be concentrated. And domestically, the politicians in that country often sell that to their people as saying, we need this for our own economic well-being. And there's some truth to that in some instances, but I think the more we can examine those claims, the better. I mean, there's concerns around the risks that these countries put themselves up for, like around gray listing and those types of international measures. But we've done some investigations over the past year into golden passport industries, including in several Caribbean countries. And again, the arguments are made that like these citizenship by investment schemes are needed to support the local economy because you give away the passports and the visas and you get investment in return. But if you kind of scratch at the surface a little bit, you see that there are professional enablers, in this case is kind of licensed agents that award, that kind of manage these schemes that receive a large portion of the investment that comes in. Often they're tied to local political elites, and then some of the projects that the investment goes into have governance risks as well. So I agree that unpacking that is important. The other point to make, I think, is our need to be able to assess the scale and harm of illicit financial flows more quickly and in real time so that the international community can respond before all the billions of dollars go out the door. Like, you mentioned Nigeria, Amelia. Like 10 years ago, I was living in Nigeria and working on oil sector transparency issues. And slowly over time, it became clear that there was very large-scale corruption happening in the oil sector under 2 governments ago. And corruption's been a problem in the Nigerian oil sector for a long time, but this had kind of reached a new level. And I think what was extremely frustrating, especially like now we know how many billions of dollars were lost during that period. But if I look back on what it was like in the middle of it, it's so frustrating to see how that opportunity was lost. This was a time of like historically high oil prices. If Nigeria had captured the benefits of that oil boom, then it could be spent on all the things, the roads, the schools, the hospitals, the energy transition to move away from its dependency on the oil sector. But what you saw was a real reluctance from the influential governments there, the multilateral institutions, international financial institutions, to appreciate the scale of the problem because it was politically inconvenient to do so. It was easier to retain polite, ongoing relationships with the government in power than it was to face kind of the crisis that was unfolding around all of us. And so I think being able to appreciate the harms of illicit financial flows in real time is a challenge that still kind of sits ahead of us.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. Andres, would you like us to close with this first round of questions with your reflections?
Sure. So, I would agree with everything that has been said. Definitely all countries suffer consequences, but I don't think all the consequences are similar to each country. So I would completely agree with you that a lot of the focus has been on the source countries. Maybe there has been this identification of tax havens, mostly of the conduit countries, but it is the destination countries that sometimes are left off the hook. I feel the tax justice network has been quite successful in trying to change the narrative, and so we have 2 indexes, the financial secrecy index and the Corporate Tax Haven Index, where we show that the biggest problem and the biggest enablers of all of this corruption and IFFs tend to be the destination countries, who share a lot of responsibility. The US, that tops our index, Switzerland, the UAE, Germany, Japan, Luxembourg, many of the countries that don't really are typically associated with that. Now, they share a lot of the responsibility, but it seems like they do not care enough to change. While grey listing might be a thing for a small conduit country or even from a source country, for the big financial centers, it's not that much the pressure that they will feel from even an international organization or blacklisting. They can simply, either because they control the international organization or simply because they can afford not to care as much. And why do I think they have, why do I think, or we think that this is happening? And why is it so hard to convince them of all these negative spillover effects and try to care more? On the one hand, there's a state capture in many of these countries. Sometimes it can be easier in a smaller island, but even in a big financial center, the financial sector can have a lot of power and leverage just to get the laws that they want, convince, as it was being said before, that it's good for the country to be a financial center, to get many company incorporation, many bank accounts, even though the rest of the country and the rest of society is not really benefiting. There are high salaries just for the financial sector, but not for the rest of them. They don't have taxes to attract business, but then the VAT that is paid by poor people is very high. So, of course, some people can benefit, maybe in the short term, maybe even in the long term, but not the country as a whole. And then the other point has to do with incentives. I feel it's not popular to say, and it's very easy for everyone to say, we are against corruption, we are against money laundering, but many times money laundering or money being laundered into a country can be good for the country. It's creating real estate, it's creating investment. So you have this thing where the FIU and the prosecutors will of course be against that, but then the Ministry of Finance says, don't put regulation, don't put more red tape, that will discourage foreign direct investment, and we want that. And they seem to have little care of whether that money coming into the country is clean or not. They need it, they need investments, they need job creation. So I feel one of the things that we are trying to work on, and I think that's part of why we're all here, for trying to think of, okay, we know it's a problem, what can we do about that? It's trying to talk about the incentives. So we know that we need to change the discourse depending where we're talking to. Some countries will care more if we talk about terrorism or even national security. Others will care more about markets and democracy. One thing also coming from the Tax Justice Network is, of course, talking about tax. And I feel many of the transparency reforms that we're talking about, beneficial ownership, for instance, which is one of the ones that I work on the most, has a big domestic revenue mobilization concept that is not being exploited. We can tell countries, this transparency is not only to stop corruption, it's also for you to be able to raise your tax revenues. If you get it right, you can also stop tax evasion and tax avoidance. And if we think about it, automatic exchange of information, or FATCA, shows that the same tools that maybe a country will promote, like bank secrecy, so as to attract unclean money or illegal money, can also be used against them. So the US started with FATCA just to be like, Americans are using the same secrecy schemes for corruption and for money laundering also to evade taxes in the US, and they did not like that. And then, of course, the anti-corruption and anti-IFF can leverage that and use automatic exchange also to fight corruption, not just for tax. But basically, I feel like it's hard, of course, to convince the countries. Many of them are run by economists who care about FDI and promoting investment. But if we say you're losing also tax revenues, maybe that's one thing where they can take more ownership and care instead of just saying that it's only to fight corruption and to help other countries for which they don't really respond. So yeah, I would say let's focus more on tax.
Let's focus more on tax. Okay, so I think that for this first round of questions, we all agree on the need of having a better understanding on the impact of illicit financial flows at the country level, macroeconomic perspective. But if there is something where we all have a good understanding, is that corruption is both a source and enabler of illicit financial flows. So my question is, how can the fight against corruption help better tackle illicit financial flows and vice versa? How can the fight against illicit financial flows contribute to the fight against corruption? And let me start by you, Ivana, in this round. I know that it's a tricky one, 2 questions in one.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So I couldn't agree more. Yes, corruption is a source and an enabler of illicit financial flows. If we had better measurements of IFF magnitudes, we would know what percentage of those illicit financial flows comes from corruption. We don't know, but we definitely know it plays a part. So from the fund perspective, we have two big policies that in which we work on illicit financial flows. One is the AML-CFT strategy, which guides all of our work in financial integrity, and that basically IFF falls in there. But we also have a governance framework that guides all of our anti-corruption work. And from that perspective, we also work on combating illicit financial flows, and they complement each other. So from that perspective, there's two ways in which we approach the issue. One, under this framework for governance work, one is transnational aspects of corruption, in which we focus on proceeds of corruption and its cross-border movement in two areas. One is the supply side, concerning the extent to which systemic corruption involves extensive bribery of public officials by private companies, and what is the framework that a country has to combat this. And the other part that we look in transnational aspects of corruption is the concealment or facilitation, and what are the frameworks in place in those countries to prevent or detect the corruption proceeds that are being laundered or that they are the destination country for. This is an approach that we started having, the transnational aspects of corruption. We cover it in all of our surveillance work stream, which is also known as the Article 4. And the trick is that countries have to volunteer for it. So we've been increasing the number of countries that have volunteered to be assessed for their frameworks for combating transnational aspects of corruption. So far, it's been 16 countries. All of what we say in those reports is public, but we hope we will continue growing. On the bright side, from those 16 countries, all of the G7 countries are covered, and about half of the G20 ones. So at least we know there's countries in which there's materiality for this analysis. And then the other part of the work that we do has to do more with the domestic corruption, how to prevent domestic corruption. And there we have an approach that is guided by what we consider the 6 state functions that are more important to the economic activity of the country. So it's more targeted. And we also work on improving the rule of law, the AML-15 framework, the central bank independence and governance, the financial sector oversight, fiscal governance. So there's 6 areas in which we focus our work and how to combat corruption and enhance governments in those areas. So the idea is, yes, we see these agendas very intertwined, and we tackle them from these 2 angles, from the AML-CFT angle and from the anti-corruption one.
Thank you so much for that. Enrique?
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's be clear. Corruption, we have, of course, part of it is being spent domestically. But as soon as it becomes significant, what you want to do is funnel it outside to protect it from maybe your political enemies who will come into power after you, or somebody who takes over your company without your approval. So corruption very much needs money laundering tactics and cross-border illicit financial flows to be profitable in the end. And I think it's also interesting to note that this is a very interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, these corruption and illicit financial flows are undermining rule of law in your own country, but you're using the protection of the rule of law in maybe transit and destination countries to protect your illicit assets. So there are barriers being raised, and I think it's very important to counter corruption by countering illicit financial flows. And I don't know if you went to the documentary a few days ago, Mafias and Banks, which showed really strongly how the global network works. But I think there's lots of points, lots of nodes that also means globally where we can intervene and where there is a point where we can have an advocacy campaign, where we can do a research, where we can come together and maybe increase beneficial ownership to counter those. Because it is global, there's many points. If maybe A doesn't work, maybe B, C, D, or E will work. The main problem, though, is that I think we are not on top of things enough. When you talk about deterrence, and I wrote this down because academics know this better than I do, Deterrence is based on punishment that is certain, swift, and significant. So not based on policies, not based on exposure, but on the certainty that there are going to be consequences, that the consequences are going to be swift, because otherwise you're already old and it doesn't matter anymore, and that they are significant. And I think both for the corrupt actors and all these enablers in all these nodes, deterrence or the punishment is not strong enough. And that is something that we could really double down on to have a big impact, I believe.
Thank you so much, Enrique, for that. Andres, looking forward to your reflections.
Yeah, so I would say, again, thinking more a bit on the solutions and some of the problems, so I would completely agree that beneficial ownership transparency, of course, is one of the ways to really tackle corruption and IFFs at the same time. Exchange of information is also a quite relevant one. We have it for bank account information. Now there's a slow progress towards real estate. I mean, hopefully we will have that for any type of asset. But now I would like to focus on two things that I think are still missing or we're not doing enough. One has to do with cooperation. So we all know that there is very little cooperation between tax and AML authorities, like between tax administrations and FIUs. I know there's slowly progress towards that area. I mean, I know the IMF has actually had a paper, I don't know if Emmanuel is here who co-authored that, on tax and AML and how they can both strengthen each other and create synergies with each other. We've also been organizing that, but we know it's hard. I mean, even FATF and the OECD don't really talk as much to each other. We see some small progress on that. There's one case, I'm from Argentina, there is the Punta del Este Declaration, which mostly involves Latin American countries, and they say, let's start cooperating more and sharing more information. But when you think from the international standards, from the get-go, for instance, exchange of information can only be used for tax purposes. And if a tax administration wants to share that with the anti-corruption, with the prosecutor, or with the FIU, that's extremely hard. They might have to ask for an authorization from the sending country, and many times they don't respond, or they say no. So it's strange to think that it's all the same state. I mean, why would one agency have access to that and not the other one when they're all supposed to be fighting financial crimes? But that's what international standards are saying. So I feel that's one area where we can work some more. Even as I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and they were saying, I was talking to a lot of prosecutors, and they were saying how exchange of information data, even if they get access to that, they cannot use that in criminal court. It's not evidence enough. So they have to do it through a judicial request on EMLA or something a bit more complex, way more lengthy and timely. So it's good to have the intelligence, but they cannot use it. And it's like, why not? I think it's Ecuador or like a Latin American country very recently changed their law to say any evidence, any piece of data that we get through exchange of information can be automatically used as evidence in criminal court. And I think some of that could be useful. I mean, why would one type of exchange cannot be used, but the other one, yes? I mean, it's authorities from countries sending it to another authority. We could be saving time. And then the last point where I think there a lot more could be done is on prevention. And maybe that's where even we at the Tax Justice might not fully agree even with other CSOs. So we think that there's a lot more to be done on prevention. And one example, again, is beneficial ownership. So many people, I think of beneficial ownership as getting their right person, the one calling the shots, and that's why they like thresholds or this control focus. Our belief is it's unlikely that we will get that person. Like even if you say who is really controlling, they will not tell you the truth. So our approach is get as much data as you want, as much data as you can. Anyone with one share, anyone with a vote, anyone with a power of attorney, and then use that data, apply AI or apply something to find undeclared relationships, find things before they happen, a bit what Alex and Enrique were saying. We're usually finding BO or using BOT when money laundering took place, when corruption took place, just to hopefully find them, hopefully find the assets. If we had the data in advance, if we had even more data, by applying lower thresholds, we might be able to find these people before they actually do the crime. We can start finding when they're creating the companies before they actually use the scheme for that. So I feel like a lot can be done on prevention and cooperation. Of course, it doesn't depend just on us, but sometimes changing the laws, for instance, to lower thresholds and cover more people, that is one thing that we keep advocating for, even though I know not even all CSOs agree with that, let alone country authorities.
Thank you, Andres. Alex?
Thanks. A couple thoughts kind of picking up on your cooperation ideas. I do think there are still more, when it comes to combating illicit financial flows, more silo breaking we need to do. I mean, there are different sources of illicit financial flows. Corruption, obviously, fraud, organized crime, tax evasion, sanction evasion. And the actors concerned with those challenges are not often the same ones. And it's not just enforcement authorities, but it's us in civil society also. Maybe not looking, I mostly worked on corruption. Now I'm looking more at organized crime. And, I think at least when you look at the reporting that my journalist colleagues have done, it's clear that when it comes to how the dirty money gathered through these different illegal activities, how it moves, in a way, a lot of the pathways are very, very similar. It doesn't matter whether it came from narco-trafficking or from embezzlement or some other type of wrongdoing. We worked with the think tank RUSI to do an analysis of all the investigative reporting we've done over the past 2 years about how Russian oligarchs tried to move their money to avoid kind of the bite of sanctions. So either they'd been sanctioned or they knew they were going to be sanctioned, and so they hired lawyers, accountants, other professional enablers to help them rearrange their business holdings and move their wealth. And so this is an issue of kind of sanction evasion challenges, but what the main findings was that the tactics they used were very similar to the tactics that other types of corrupt officials might use or organized crime figures might use. They set up anonymous companies and trusts. They put their assets in the names of their family members or their proxies. They engage in jurisdiction shopping. So they try to set up here, and then they can't, so then they move here. And what's clear also is that the role of the enablers themselves. They're hiring the same types of professionals to help move their money through the global financial system. And in some instances, they're hiring the same exact officials that have been implicated in other very different types of illicit financial flow activity. So I think agreed that just a more joined up approach to trying to take some of this forward would be helpful.
Thank you. Let's look into the future now. It's not a new problem. We are all going to agree on this. Efforts to tackle illicit financial flows have been insufficient for now, or at least they have not yielded expected results. So what innovative approach or emerging trends should we be looking at to effectively tackle illicit financial flows going forward? Andres, I see you nodding and smiling, so I'm sure you want to kick us off in this third round.
I'm happy to start. So actually, I almost recently found out about this really amazing tool, and the only reason why I did it is because I got a consultancy to research that. I mean, I kind of knew about it before, but it wasn't until I actually studied it that I realized it's, for me, a game changer. Of course, we want public access, and we've talked about that many times, but this one that I feel is underutilized and unexploited is something called mandatory disclosure rules. So what it means in practice is it's pretty much asking enablers, the lawyers, the accountants, the tax planners, to disclose the schemes that they are offering and even selling, either to lower the taxes or to hide beneficial owners. It's really like asking a magician to reveal their tricks. It's really saying, tell me what it is that you're doing and how you're doing that. So they're supposed to reveal the laws that are involved and how they interpret them, the types of companies that you have to incorporate to deliver whatever scheme it is, to evade taxes, to hide the beneficial owner, whatever it is, they're supposed to explain all of that. To say who has acquired that, which are the taxpayers or the individuals that actually bought your service to engage in this scheme, how much money was saved, everything. This is something that started in the 80s, and it's not like some idea. This is actually in the law in many countries. It's actually part of standards, but again, are underutilized from my perspective. I think it got more strength when the OECD took this under BEPS, which is this base erosion profit shifting project to tackle tax avoidance. It's under Action 12, just as a point of reference. The OECD had a similar thing because they found out, and we at the Tax Assist Network were disclosing, there's all these schemes to be avoiding the CRS. You just go to Puerto Rico, you go to all these countries that are participating. So then they designed, again, a similar system of rules that tax planners or intermediaries are supposed to report, where they explain what is a scheme to hide the beneficial owner or to avoid the automatic exchange. In the EU, this was incorporated by DAC 6. It's the Directive of Administrative Cooperation, number 6. It covers both BEPS 12 and hiding the BO and avoiding the CRS. They are amazing. Of course, it's not working well. Like, I've even talked to friends who work at law firms or at companies, and I say, like, so are you reporting this? And they're like, nah, we don't. In many countries, I mean, when you look at statistics, they start reporting everything, and then it goes down. Sometimes they like, oh, it's working. Like, they stop doing tax avoidance. Most likely, they realize nothing happens, so they stop the reporting. But the point is, this is in the standards. This is the law in many countries already, including the EU, and it's something that I feel like no one is really exploiting or using. Of course, the lawyers are going to complain, and I might talk about more of that later, but it's a rule that it's amazing once it works, and I feel like we just need to keep pushing for that, strengthening that, and enforcing that. But I think that can be a game changer if and once it works.
Game changer, pushing, implementation. Enrique, from your side?
Yeah, talking about innovation, I'm going to be a little bit of a rebel and say I just want the things that we have already to be implemented rightfully. You know, sometimes we talk about AI, ChatGPT, blockchain, and all of that is great and could help. But I think, or even when it comes to illicit actions like crypto and all of that, we are struggling just with the basic, like cash is still king. And I think there's a lot that we already have on paper, but are not implemented. And what I just want to advocate for is also for us all to not accept paper-based changes any longer. And just one example that comes to mind, in the UAE that you already mentioned, Andres, we now have a civil war in Sudan, and we know that the UAE, just like Iran and Egypt, are very heavily involved with supporting the funding and the arms used by the conflict partners. And the UAE has just been removed from the Financial Action Task Force grey list. And one of the areas is the due diligence improvement that they, on paper, made for the gold sector. And just after they were removed, we now have a new report from the UN panel of experts of ongoing arms and gold trades. We have Dubai Uncovered or Unlocked, yeah, exactly, which has sanctioned individuals, also individuals linked to the Sudanese rapid support forces. So I just want this paper-based changes or this for the Bühne, the facade of making changes to end. And we have to be very honest on when we give somebody the green light and continue trading with them. And I think there has to be real consequences of making changes only on paper, but just continuing business as usual in practice.
I really like that. Implementation changes not only in paper, but really walking that talk. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up right where you left off, I mean, I think OCCRP worked with 70 media partners around the world on this Dubai Unlocked project, and it kind of showed the flow of dirty money into Dubai real estate. On our website, there's more than 200 profiles of narco-traffickers, corrupt public officials, individuals implicated in terrorism finance, dozens of people who've been sanctioned, many who've been convicted of crimes, and the property that they hold in Dubai. And I think it was frustrating while this project was underway to see the FATF make its decision to take the UAE off the gray list. But to make an effort at maybe a silver lining, I think one of the phrases that I've gotten most allergic to in these conferences is whack-a-mole. Has anyone heard of that? I feel like everyone comes up in every panel I'm in. And it's this idea that unless every country improves its measures against illicit financial flows, it doesn't matter. Because the dirty money will be closed off here, and then it can just move here or there. And I just am not convinced that, yes, that risk is real, and we need to get, as many countries on board as possible to adopt new reforms. But I think in some ways the near-term goals are about making corruption more expensive and more inconvenient. And I think what we saw after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a shift of billions of dollars in Russian assets out of Western financial markets and to the UAE and other places where they were still accepted. Now, is it a problem that they were welcomed with open arms there? Yeah, sure. But I do think it is a sign that, like, those oligarchs had to incur costs that they would not have otherwise. And in some ways, that's what we're working for as we kind of chip away at this challenge, is making sure that if you have dirty money that you want to put in a bank account and then spend on luxury assets, you should have to work exceptionally hard and spend a lot of money to hire your accountants, to hire your lawyers, and to find banks and property willing to accept your money. And, you know, we got to go after the bad guys. I totally agree on the enforcement point. But on the prevention side, I think that is progress, even if it's not, you know, across every jurisdiction where we're seeing huge gains.
Ivana?
So I think I'm going to echo a lot of the things that you're saying and focus on three things that we think are important to focus moving forward. And it's actually along the lines of we need to better implement what is already out there, and how do we do that? So the first point, or the first key issue that we think needs to be done, is a better understanding of risks. And for all of you that maybe know the FATF standards, you know it's the first recommendation that a country needs to understand their money laundering and terrorist financing risks. And many countries are doing national risk assessments to try to understand this. However, whenever you read those national risk assessments, it's about the domestic risks. They're never looking at, or never or very rarely looking at cross-border risks. And illicit financial flows are cross-border by nature. So if you're not looking at that risk, then how are you going to mitigate it if you're not even paying attention when you're doing this exercise? So it's not reinventing the wheels. Countries are already doing national risk assessments. Pay more attention to cross-national risks and the consequences that they have in the economy. That's the other part that we don't see in these assessments. So we think we maybe need to expand the coverage and maybe the quality of these exercises so that they really look into these things. So that would be the first, better understanding of risk, and we can use the tools that are already out there from the AML-CFT standards. The second one would be, again, following a little bit the standard. It says, well, once you understand your risks, you take the measures to mitigate them, because nobody has enough resources to do everything all the time. But if we start having a better understanding of the cross-country risks and how is that impacting your economy, then you can start having policies that are a lot more tailored. Again, these are things that we hear all the time, but we don't think it's happening enough yet. So, for example, if you're a source country, as I was saying at the beginning, you know, you try to think, where does this country stand in the chain of illicit financial flows, and you know that you have a serious corruption problem, then you would try to prevent that money from leaving your country, and then you would maybe focus on having good PEP, the implementation of the PEP regulations and the supervision of that the banks are really trying to identify them. So you can start picking and making sure that that is the one policy that is working well in your country, so that you can prevent the money from flowing outside. If you're a transit country, then you can have you can try to see how your enablers are operating and what are the regulations that you need to be putting there, or how do you mitigate that risk. And maybe for destination countries, I think I would go back to the issue of collaboration, and that's, again, my third point, I would say. And so that's why I think it's repetitive or echoing what you've been saying. We need to work together. All the countries need to work together a lot better for tackling illicit financial flows. And it's a cross-border risk. There's not a way in which one country can do it. You really need to have a better coordination, exchange of information, collaboration, timely exchanges, so that you can do this. So those would be the three areas that we think we need to do more and better.
Thank you so much. And before we open the floor for questions from the audience, let me ask you one last question. Based on your expertise, understanding, knowledge, are there any specific recommendations you would make to governments and international bodies to strengthen the fight against illicit financial flows? Enrique, would you like to share some of them?
Definitely. No, many of them. But what I would love to pick up on is also what Alex mentioned about not being despaired. There definitely is hope. And sometimes I forget, but the first offshore leak was 2013. We're only working on this for 10 years. And when I started 10, 12 years ago, financial crime, sanctions, fraud, it was a very niche topic. I don't know if you all remember, but it was like a birthday party downer, right? I would never say, oh, this is what I do, great. But now with the full invasion of Ukraine, it's very much on everybody's mind. It's even now in national security or European security strategies. So the importance and the awareness has raised a lot. And not just here in the West, but I would also say the internet and just the reporting that has been done by amazing organizations, by TI, by OCCRP, by the Century, it does create an impact also on the ground. And I just wanted to highlight one of the most egregious reports that I have seen from the Century. In 2022, we published a report about $1 billion that vanished, that was meant to go to food, fuel, and medicine when there was a famine in South Sudan. And we exposed how $1 billion of that, through letters of credit and through regional banks, just disappeared. And that definitely had an outcry because it was a loan. It still needed to be repaid. So, and the money wasn't used for the intended purpose, and it increased a massive debt that still needed to be repaid by future generations. And we really try to use the internet and means to communicate the message. We try to translate into local language, do a PDF that can be shared easily through WhatsApp. But I think the one recommendation that I would love to highlight is communicate clearly and counter the disinformation that sometimes is targeted when it comes to sanctions, for example, or these kind of topics. The economic impact comes from the corrupt actors and not from targeted network sanctions that are being imposed afterwards. But there's a lot of disinformation being had towards those that want to do it right. So I just wanted to highlight that recommendation for governments.
Communicate clear, counter misinformation. Alex, I feel that this is right for you to share also your recommendations if there is anything that you would like to share with us now.
Yeah, and I definitely second all of that. But I do want to take an opportunity just to highlight specifically what an important role the IMF can play in dealing with corruption and illicit financial flows issues. I just like the path of the last 10 years you mentioned, like, I do think there's progress that's been made, and I think that's very encouraging. The problem is kind of the topic of this panel, that the costs of corruption are extremely high, and so a very kind of gradual degree of improvement is to be lauded, but we really need to be moving forward as quickly as possible in order to prevent the harms of corruption from reaching doing even more damage. I think it has been good to see the topic feature more explicitly in IMF affairs, be recognized as macrocritical, some of the analytical work that's come out, and some country programs. But I think just kind of elevating these issues even further on the agenda, doing more governance diagnostics, making sure those and the relevant conditionalities are made available to the public, and also the source of real civil society consultation. And again, to pick up on something you were talking about earlier, I think there is this real disconnect between committing to setting up new institutions or passing new laws, those types of reforms, which are often much easier to implement when you're seeking external financing, but not always where the rubber meets the road, and how the IMF can use its influence to push for those tools, which are important, but what matters a lot more is their use and enforcement and real results on the ground in combating corruption. So again, just to really encourage that work to be taken forward with a lot of urgency.
Ivana?
Sure. And I think we know all of those points. I think we're conscious of it. I mean, I cannot speak for like the 3,000 people that are in the IMF, but certainly for the divisions I'm representing today. And let me just take 1 second to explain why. I mean, I do think we take this very seriously, and we want to do more in these areas. When I talk about having policies, the policies that guide our work in anti-corruption or in AML-CFT, they are approved by our board. Our board represents 190 countries, and that also gives us the possibility of working with the 190 countries in these topics. So this is why it's not just, oh, it's a document. No, it's actually something that is quite important for us and really matters for our work as an institution. And these policies is not a one-off. Once we have them, we are mandated to review them every X number of years. And when we do a review, we look backwards to what we have done and if we've done good or not good and what we need to do more. And it's also, so therefore, it's a forward-looking exercise. We also say, okay, for the next 5 years, what do we want to achieve that we haven't achieved in the last 5 years? And we just reviewed our AML-CFT strategy. And that paper that I was referring to at the very beginning of our conversation on illicit financial flows is a background paper to the review of our strategy, which says we need to do more on this, and this is what we're planning to do. And for instance, when we talk about we need to understand better the risks, we're actually developing an analytical tool to understand cross-border payments better. We have access to cross-border payments. We have AI, and we're analytical. With this analytical tool, we're now sitting down with governments and saying, did you look at these risks of cross-border payments that we don't see in your national risk assessment? So these policies enable us to have these conversations, and this is why and we definitely know we need to do more, and that's the plan. And that's what we set out in that review that was published in December. And also because I think we are placed in a very unique position by our membership. When you can have these conversations with 190 countries, it opens up a lot of opportunities for dialogue and for change. Change does not always happen at the pace we would all want to see, but at least having those conversations hopefully take us there. So I guess that's what we are trying to do. It's not our advice for ourselves or for the governments, but more of our commitment to work more on this.
Do you mind if I respond to that quickly? Just to echo both of your statements. I completely agree with both. I think the IMF is super strong, and other bilateral lenders, when it comes to policies and framework. Maybe I'm a nerd, but I love your Article 4 reports, and I am excited when a new one is published, and I read them religiously, and I share them internally. But what Alex was saying, I think that is absolutely true. I think any new law, any anti-corruption law, any new institution, even setting up a financial intelligence unit, anything can be misused. It's about the implementation. And we saw one example where a country didn't have an FIU, and very good, they were encouraged to do so. And then it was lauded that they did so, but then we got from our sources in the country that they only received a single suspicious activity report in the last year. And we asked the banks, why is that? Why are you not reporting now that you finally have an FIU? And they said, look, we don't feel the FIU is independent, and we know it will be misused for corruption cases, but only targeting political enemies. So things, again, might look good on paper or might be implemented, but it's really about where the rubber meets the road, and anything can be used for good and for evil. And I just would love for bilateral lenders, aid providers, FDI investments to really dig deeper and make sure that we hold accountable for the execution and not just what's being done on paper. Thank you.
Sorry, can I add one?
Yep, please.
I know,
And then Andres, promise.
The women are taking over.
I fully second what you're saying, and I think collaborating, and for instance, the fund collaborating more with civil society is part of our strategy for the next 5 years, because maybe it's easier, not easy is not the right word, but you see conditionality and we are saying, okay, this country doesn't have an FIU, let's have an FIU, let's ask this country that is in a lending program to set up an FIU. And then civil society can, if we have a good collaboration, can be the ones that come and when we are reviewing that program, when we are following up on these measures and the implementation, because we do follow up, can say, well, actually, they're not receiving STRs because this is the issue. So that collaboration really is important to us because this information is really important to also how we design conditionality and what we write in our policy advice. So certainly collaboration is also part of that strategy. So thank you. Sorry.
Andres.
I'll finish. So I would say that we find that there is a huge threat to transparency. So we finally got to the point where like almost everyone agrees with many of the policies. BO, beneficial ownership transparency, exchange of information, like even FATF is asking for a registry. We got there, but now we find that the biggest threat is the weaponization of the rights to privacy and data protection, and especially what is happening at the courts. So I feel like we got the prosecutors, the members of parliament, the authorities, everyone agrees, like CSOs, that we need these, but we haven't convinced the judges yet, and there's a bunch of lawyers and enablers that are unfortunately been quite successful in stopping all of these advances just by invoking and weaponizing the rights to privacy and data protection. So the obvious example that was really sad for us was the European Court of Justice ruling of 2022, which invalidated public access, but again, it didn't stop there. Lawyers, and usually some of the same law firms, have also managed to stop automatic exchange of bank account information. They got it in Belgium, even though it was overturned. They tried in the UK, and they're trying everywhere. Even this scheme of mandatory disclosure rules in Belgium, again, through the European Court of Justice, lawyers also managed to say, like, no, we don't need to do this. And even more worryingly, there is currently a legal opinion that was published 2 weeks ago by the Advocate General to the European Court of Justice that pretty much says that she's trying to expand legal professional privilege, basically the confidentiality that applies to lawyers, to say it doesn't only apply to defending a client in court, also when a lawyer creates companies. So something which is essential. Like we know, and like FATF has been saying, like lawyers creating companies is one of the biggest risks. There's one case where a lawyer was saying, like, I'm going to help you create a company because I can use my professional confidentiality so that then no one will ask questions. And now the Advocate General is, in a way, supporting that position of this lawyer. And the worst part of that is that it's not only saying, like, legal professional privilege is relevant and we have to expand that. She's also saying this is based on the right to privacy. This is a case between a law firm and a company, and she's saying we have to protect legal professional privilege based on the right to private family life, so something that should only apply to individuals. Now, even though, again, the courts are, I feel like, one of the problems, and I feel like we need to target them more and like either bring more awareness of all these issues, but I feel like FATF and the Global Forum and standards also have a role to play here. When you look at the standards, many times they say lawyers and obliged entities have to file suspicious transaction reports unless they are protected by legal professional privilege. You have to exchange information, you cannot invoke or block it with banking secrecy or blah, 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 unless there's professional privilege. So why are we saying that? Or why are standards letting countries decide that, knowing that they're not doing it right? So what we think is that countries' laws and international standards have to be very clear that privacy and data protection cannot and should not be used, the same with legal professional privilege, to prevent this transparency. We need to make the case again about this public interest that goes beyond. And again, we know that it's not just to protect the vulnerable, which is in a way what human rights are supposed to do. They're weaponizing this for the criminals, the high net worth individuals, or the multinational companies. That is not what they were meant to be done. So I feel like we are all agreeing on, like, yeah, all these policies, but then the judges and the lawyers are stopping us. And I feel like that's where I think a lot of the more focus we need to work on, because otherwise all of what we're getting here is stopped by the courts. So that's why, yeah, I will really focus on stopping this weaponization of privacy and data protection.
That's very, very clear. And we still have some minutes, so we really want to open the floor for questions, comments from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand. I see that we have here, there, and there. Thanks so much for helping us. If you want to shortly introduce yourself before making your question or comment, that would be great. I will be taking 2 to 3 questions and then go back to the speakers. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Leila Siedbek. I am from NGO Freedom for Eurasia. So I have a question, and I've actually wanted to ask this question for a while now, and ask it directed at somebody who is working at a lending financial institution. So my question is, we work in the region, on the region of Central Asia and Russia, investigating corruption and kleptocracy at our NGO. And my question is, how fair is it, knowing that these countries, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, we know now for sure that these countries are kleptocracies, and these countries are run by their rulers as their own private criminal enterprises. We know they steal the money. They know that they use the money that they steal in their countries and bring it outside and store that money in the West. So my question is, how fair is it for these countries and these authorities to continue having access to international lending institutions and to continue being able to tap into this, funding opportunities? And is there a way to somehow limit their ability to do that, because they continue borrowing the money, and obviously they take it back to their country and they squander it. They spend it on their own self-enrichment. And from what we saw throughout the years, there was very little impact on the people from the money that has been borrowed so far. I hope I was clear. Sorry.
You are super, super clear. Thank you so much for that question. I will probably take one question from here, so we go exchanging and then go back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I think I kind of complement your question.
Sorry, if you want to introduce yourself,
Yes.
that would be great.
Denise Wolte, KfW, German Development Bank. I think it's actually maybe a question, how do we make destination countries feel more responsible and change a bit of our story? I mean, I'm an economist. I totally get this Article 4, IMF, all that stuff. But I kind of feel, I think most of the population is not aware that Germany is a destination for money laundering. And I think Switzerland also feels pretty good about its own way it's managing things. And I think there needs to be a different story kind of showing, yes, money still stinks when it arrives at your destination, because it was done by whatever war crimes or whatever mining activities actually led to getting this money in the country. Because we actually have a saying like money doesn't stink, and I would say, yes, it does stink. And the question is, though, how do we, I mean, I'm an economist, I love all this stuff, but I think most of the population doesn't get it, and we need a different story. And I'm thinking about this sanction where the guy, I think he said, like in Finland, all of a sudden it turns out that the ice hockey stadium was actually financed by a sanctioned individual. And don't we need like a story, maybe even social media, saying, do you really want to go with your kids into this ice hockey stadium that actually is financed by this individual who maybe has even brothels and does child prostitution? And then get to the discussion of illicit financial flows, which is, it's highly technical, to be honest, and so far away. And I think we need those stories.
Absolutely. I think that we had also a hand there. And I see you, Sasha.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Vincent Freigang. I'm a researcher at Transparency International. And my question was around measuring of IFFs. And I was very encouraged by the IMF's approach in the Nordic-Baltic report around using macroeconomic data to do a top-down analysis of where are the flows going and how much of that is unexplained, and then the bottom-up approach at transaction level. I thought it was kind of the first real change or new, fresh approach to measuring these risks that I've seen in a long time. And I was wondering, you mentioned now having this tool and talking to national authorities about this. How can we get, especially, I think, authorities in typical destination countries that also have more resources and capacity to implement this sort of stuff, how can we get them to implement this data more systematically in their national risk assessments? Can we mandate it from them? Do we see that as a way to sort of address this a bit more systematically and move away from the slightly, I think, crude way in which sort of risky jurisdictions, etc., are assessed at the moment, and yeah, what plans the IMF might have there. And additionally, if any of that data can ever be published or made public, I know the report from the Nordic-Baltic region included some of that data. But yeah, I think collaboration there with CSOs and academics would be very, very interesting because obviously access to transaction data is always an issue, but I think would be really the next step to better assessing this.
Thank you. We still have three questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back now to the speakers and then go back to these three questions. So in this first round of questions, we had very concrete questions and also suggestions on the communication front, how we can make this topic more tangible so that if we can say ordinary citizens understands the impact. Also kleptocracy and countries, is there a way in which we can limit their access to financial support and measurement of illicit financial flows? Ivan, I don't know if you want to start addressing some of these questions, and then, of course, Alex, Enrique, Andres, if you also want to answer a couple of them, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. I'll go in order, since I took time. I'm going to respond quickly, but I am available to discuss bilaterally also if you feel like I have not fully responded, and my email is also available for whoever wants to continue this conversation. So, it's a question I have heard many times, what you were asking us about how fair it is that they can continue to access this lending. And I think here it's important to take a step back, and we operate under the mandate of the IMF. The IMF is basically owned by its members. It's 190 countries, and all the money we lend comes from those countries and is given to a country that is in an economic crisis. So our mandate is to help the countries when they go into an economic crisis. So if we started factoring in if an economic crisis of a country is more important than the other because of who is ruling that country and not really caring for the people that are there, it would be very tricky. So we do engage with all of the countries, and that is something that I think we will continue to do. On the bright side, the policies that we have been implementing, and especially the anti-corruption one, the governance framework that came in 2018, even though we had always worked on corruption, we even measured how many times the word corruption was used prior to 2018 and after 2018, and it skyrockets. We are being a lot more candid. We are having these conversations. We have conditionality. We're trying to set up the frameworks so that the money cannot be stolen. So another example that we can mention is during the emergency financing, all the lending that we gave for COVID related reasons. We asked the countries to commit that, for instance, almost all of the countries that received emergency financing had to publish who were the beneficial owners of the companies that were providing COVID-related services or goods. So what we're saying is with these policies, we engage in dialogue with countries through the Article 4 to try to prevent these things, to try to build the frameworks for these things to no longer happen. If it's lending, we try to have conditionality. So yes, we engage with every single country when they are in need, but that doesn't mean that we don't address these issues also. I know maybe not to the extent that a lot of people would want, but we're still engaging and we're still having that dialogue. So destination countries being more accountable, I don't know if accountable is the word that I would use, but definitely trying to raise more awareness about how illicit financial flows do have an impact in the economy of destination countries as well, even if it's very integrated and it's hard to link it to the original crimes. So that's part of the work that we're trying to do with illicit and financial flows, and trying to understand cross-border risks and trying to understand how that impacts in the economy of the country. That is everything that we're trying to really push for the next 5 years. And when I was saying we do have an understanding of the impact in source countries, I don't want to say we don't focus in source countries, because they will always be a focus of our work, but we're saying we really need to work on this area too, because destination countries are also something that we need to understand and work a lot more. And that also comes with communications. Maybe we're not the better ones for communication aspects, but definitely for raising awareness with the country authorities on what is the impact. Thank you that you like the Nordic-Baltic project. We are actually very proud of that, and we were trying to do something very different with that project. That tool, the tool itself, because the data, this is not up to us. We actually have access to SWIFT data. SWIFT data is not public, so we cannot make the data public. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to access it ourselves anymore. So, but what we do is we use it in the conversations with countries. We are asking them, and when I say we use it in the conversations, it means in the case of Nordic Baltic, it was technical assistance, and that's why it's a report that we were able to publish. When the authorities request technical assistance and we produce those reports, they can agree to publish it, and in this case, they did, and that's why we could do it. But it's not the only instance in which we publicize this. In our Article 4s, we're starting to embed the issue of the country needs to look more at the cross-border risks, and we specify why we think that's an issue. If the country's doing the NRA, maybe they're not doing it with us, but it's something that we raise, and we definitely raise it in the context of the financial sector assessments, the stability FSAPs. Sorry. In the FSAPs, we do a deep dive, and we have sat down with authorities of several countries and show them this is what we see in our cross-border analysis. How do you explain it? How does it relate to your economic fundamentals? Can you explain it based on your economy that you're getting all of these flows from all of these countries? And there's an anecdote, I'm not going to name the country, but a country actually had not looked at those flows, and they sat down and did their own analysis so to see how they could respond to what we were saying. So we're using the data in our conversation with countries, even if we don't necessarily have the capacity to publish it in every single time. But in all of those instances in which we can, we do. Most of our documents are public at the end of the day. So more to see.
Andres, Enrique, Alex, is there anything that you would like to add?
Just a quick comment on the issues about the local relevance of this agenda and how to communicate that. I mean, I think it's something that even the journalists at OCCRP talk about not always being good. We're good at kind of tracing a bunch of transactions to the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, but telling the why part, I just agree with you, it needs to be done more and done better. I do think it does also relate to what I was trying to say before about looking across the whole range of wrongdoing that generates illicit financial flows. I mean, in the US right now, the harm that is being caused to families across the country due to illegal drug use, and especially fentanyl, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And the scale of the death and the harm to communities, I mean, it's a very live issue to politicians, but also just ordinary people. And that's transnational crime, and there's illicit financial flows that are enabling that drug trade, and they're using anonymous shell companies, they're using secrecy jurisdictions, sorry, it's very late on this Friday. And so I think that it is also being savvy, but also sensitive to what people do care about, because people are dealing with a lot of issues that may trump kind of corruption in a faraway land when they're deciding what to care about.
Just add on that point is that, again, I completely agree that maybe the news stories are the best case, but when we have our index and we try to say like Germany, Japan, or the US, Switzerland, they are on top, that can start conversation. I mean, my boss also wrote in Germany, Steueroase Deutschland, and so it was like a book saying like, Germany is a tax haven, and many Germans didn't consider that. So after that book, there were conversations. I mean, I know he was on TV many times, so at least we try to provide the data why that's the case, so that can start the conversations, although I think maybe the news articles would be the ones that will push local, the most, but still like we are trying to just point to that and show why that's the case.
Enrique?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, finally, just to add, I wanted to get back to the Uzbekistan. Oh, yeah, she's still there in the corner in my eye. I think we have definitely made progress on a lot of things, but I think we also have to be honest that not everything is really being executed. And I was just thinking, and this goes again for IMF, for aid distributors, and one example from Myanmar comes to mind when I was living there. We now see, since the coup took over, for example, that aid is still being distributed through the central government, which is now totally captured by the junta. And the aid only goes to the areas of the country that is affiliated with the junta, not to the areas that's actually where it's needed the most and where the airstrikes are happening. And the same thing we saw before the coup when it came to COVID pandemic emergency funding, is that on paper they promised they would provide proof of delivery reports, which were never delivered, and procurement reports with beneficial ownership information and the names of the companies receiving the money. And we had a look at those reports, and we saw that there were companies that were involved, known with illicit trade trafficking, and we saw that the mosque being charged to the IMF were 5 times market value. So these kind of things, there is still a disconnect. And I think sometimes they feel that there are no consequences, that they can still get away with it. But of course, we shouldn't, and I completely agree with you, we shouldn't say we are not engaging. We are cutting off all funding, all aid for economies that are in distress and that are needed. But I think there is a balance to be had between the amazing policies on paper and what's being done in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going. Thanks so much. I see that you already have the mic there, so we have questions there, here, and there as well.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to actually make a remark that maybe a speaker would want to comment on. So my name is Gregory. I work for TIA Russia, and I'm a lawyer. And I really urge you not to become fanatic in the way when you pursue corruptioners, because I don't need to preach anyone that illicit financial flows, it's extremely bad for human rights. But also, you know, bad people also have human rights. And also, you do not always know who is bad and who is a good person. And I mean, for example, these FATF rules, they may be used in order to, you know, to suppress civil society or just to discriminate the whole, like, people based on their nationality. That's what basically happens now with Iranians and Russians, because in many countries they basically cannot open a banking account, they cannot send a remittance. And no, of course, FATF, it does not prohibit transactions, but banks are just doing overcompliance. You don't have any redress, any effective instrument, because you can't complain or your complaint won't be effective. And I mean, then you, like, it's important, these rules are important, but because there is no effective redress against misuse of these rules, but just one example, that financial institutions basically refuse to, in many countries, to have any transactions with people from these countries. Or look at from the other hand, I mean, as a lawyer, I'm completely unhappy with the European Court of Justice decision, you know, that abolished the beneficiary ownership registries in the European Union, the public UBO. But also, I can understand some reasoning behind the court decision, because it's always a question of balance between public and private. And I mean, the confidentiality privilege of a lawyer, it's, yeah, you may be outraged with it, but also it exists because it exists for protection of human rights and for some purpose. And if it is misused, it does not mean you have to, like, abolish this privilege for anything related to corruption, because, you know, like, only about 10 years ago was this hysteria about terrorism. And everybody said, let's abolish every due diligence, everything for anti-terrorism purposes. But I don't think it's the right way. And the same way is about financial flows. Like, we came through a way when 20 years ago there was almost no financial control. Now we have a lot of financial control, but let's not forget about human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We have here Sasha that has been waiting, and then also there.
Thanks so much. This is a really smart discussion. I'm just wondering, so given that these IACCs happen once every 2 years, I'm wondering how open could the IMF be to hosting a multi-day workshop where we come together as practitioners and identify key problems, like step by step, with, like, you know, from illicit financial flows, imagining them from the source countries into the host countries, and think through, like, what are some of the policy challenges or the barriers to it to address them. What I'm going to recognize is at the conferences, we have these really great sessions, and then we ask some questions. There's like some dinners, but we don't actually get together and like think through what can be some of the policy solutions. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, like, is there, perhaps maybe I should have mentioned this in the CSO session earlier this morning, but I'm just wondering how, like, could there be an openness to trying something like this?
We have there as well.
Hello, I'm Omar Yakubu, Center for Fiscal Transparency in Nigeria. Yeah, my question is bordered around, we all agree illicit financial flows is a global problem. So what mechanisms do you think we can improve on or activate to solve this global problem? Because from one of the speakers said the FATF mechanism doesn't seem to solve all this problem. If a country was just removed from the grey list, and the following week or two, there's another report indicting them on doing the opposite, then it means we need to interrogate either the FATF mechanism, because I'm assuming that's the umbrella mechanism to solve this problem, or bring together the FATF mechanism, maybe together with the IMF and other mechanisms to see how we can solve this problem, both from the destination, the source, and the source and the destination of these funds. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just want to check that we have no further questions. Yeah, we have one there.
Yeah, it's me again. So my question really is, when talking about lending mechanisms for the countries, would it be possible to maybe for the future, and maybe on during the events that my colleague there suggested, maybe organized by IMF, to see if there is a way to apply ratings such as, for example, the Transparency International's anti-corruption rating for the countries, to give them some sort of an incentive to, to take some steps inside their own countries and fight with the corruption and actually accomplish things that we are asking them to do for many years, because otherwise there is really no motivation. And I understand it might sound, I don't know, unrealistic maybe, but maybe it's not that unrealistic to at least say, well, it's like, when people come to the bank and they want to take a loan, the bank obviously checks whether or not you are eligible for a loan. So could we not think about something like that applied to countries?
Thank you. So we still have 5 minutes, so we're going to have almost 1 minute each of you to reply. I think that we have a question around rankings, if there is a possibility of organizing kind of a workshop coming together with civil society to think through policy challenges, and most importantly, solutions to tackle them together and not to wait every 2 years for the conference to come together. The misuse or overuse of some rules and how this can be tackled, and then also the concrete example of Nigeria that was mentioned. So I think, Enrique, that you wanted to comment on this of misuse of rules, and the first questions that we had from the colleague from TI Russia. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very good question. And we always say in our reports that we are completely against de-risking an entire country or a population. And we shouldn't forget that the victims of kleptocratic, corrupt leaders and businessmen are foremost the people of that country. And there shouldn't be a complete ban on transactions or bank accounts from everyday people. We do organize banking roundtables, and we regularly say that because unfortunately we do see it in certain countries like the DRC or Russia or Iran, Myanmar, where just being based in that country or having a phone number linked to that account from that country, that your account is being closed. And unfortunately, they say that the cost of compliance sometimes doesn't outweigh having that business. But I would completely agree with your assessment that access to banking and international banking is a human right to some extent, and we need to be able to support that. And I just completely agree with your point. And we never want to ban the Russian people from having bank accounts, or just, they didn't do anything wrong, in my opinion.
Ivana, Andres, Alex, I don't know.
I mean, I think there was a reference also to what I was saying, so I'll just respond to that part. I mean, by all means, every individual deserves human rights and has human rights, but I wasn't trying to suggest the opposite. And I also agree that there should also always be a balance. In the case of public access to beneficial ownership, I thought the balance was more than right. I mean, there were many provisions in the directive about not showing the date of birth, even allowing that if someone actually felt their life was in danger, had any risk, they could apply and actually get their data not be publicly disclosed. In the case of the UK, where there was evidence or data, I think only about like 300 people even asked out of like more than 1 million companies. So even though that was allowed, many people were not using that. So I think the whole thing of saying like it is invalid or by its, I think that the ruling went too far, although I'm quite happy the way the AML packages solves that, even though it's not public, but within the legitimate interest, I think they did a pretty good job, although we hope we will get public restored. About legal professional privilege, again, it is relevant, and it is a human right, and it is part of the rule of law. Now, the idea that anything a lawyer touches, especially when they're creating companies, will be protected, and even authorities cannot get access to that, I find that to be quite problematic. There are some countries that have even like a balanced approach, which could have been proposed even, which is to send the data to some committee of people of the Bar Association and some authorities that are third parties, and they can decide, is this subject to privilege or not? Should we redact some parts? Instead of saying like, anything a lawyer touches will be privileged. Because that's what they are promoting themselves to do. And I feel like that is really the problem we should tackle. Even the International Bar Association says, privilege stops when a lawyer is helping and engaging in unlawful activities and even helping money laundering. They cannot do that. But if they have privilege, how do you know if they're doing it or not? I mean, if you cannot even access their data. So I feel like, again, that legal opinion, I think it's going too far. So I'm in favor of balance, and I wasn't suggesting that we should abolish legal professional privilege, but it definitely shouldn't apply, or at least much more narrowed than a full absolute extension when it comes to lawyers just creating companies, which is what any other person could be doing, and I don't think has to do with the rule of law or defending a client in trial where there is still privilege.
Ivana?
Very quickly, because I also leave some time for Alex. Let me maybe give a joint answer for the question from Russia and from Nigeria, because they both had a relationship with the FATF, even though I don't work for FATF, but we do implement their standard and we recognize it as part of our work. So what you're describing is a misuse of the standard and a misinterpretation, and it's a non-effective way of implementing the standard. That is not what the standard says. And that is not what is expected from banks. They are not supposed to simply not have any Russian clients. They're supposed to be doing due diligence to see where the source of the money is from. And there's all of these safeguards that are in place in the standard so that they can still offer banking services to everyone. So and that's the point exactly that I was trying to say when we say, okay, countries are doing the national risk assessment, but are they really doing it in an effective way? Are they really looking at all of the risks? Maybe the cross-border risks need more attention. So I think the key word here is effective. It's not only having the laws in the paper and trying to implement them in a way, it's also doing it in a way that is really achieving the results that you're effectively is about meeting the objectives that you're trying to reach. So you're trying to keep dirty money out of the financial system, not trying to keep people out of the financial system. And you're trying to combat IFFs. So again, it's a very quick response, but I think we have to really focus on effectiveness on how we're implementing these things in the future. And let me see. I don't know. I mean, I cannot make a commitment to organize that event, but it sounds very interesting, and I think we have opportunities to have those kind of exchanges in the annual meetings and the spring meetings. We do jointly with the World Bank, which I cannot speak for the World Bank, but I think they would also be interested in this conversation. So. Why not? Let's keep in touch and see, because I think it's a great idea. we're out of time, but we actually have centralized assessments of the risks of certain countries for corruption. These are public. They're not public, but it's public that we do it. And we take them into consideration when we engage with countries. So I'm going to be very candid. I don't think we will ever publish a rating or a ranking of countries, because that would be against our mandate as an institution. But that doesn't mean we don't do our own work of trying to understand what is happening in the countries and what are the risks and the vulnerabilities and the issues that need to be addressed. And when the board all of the lending that we provide needs to be approved by our board. It's not a decision of the staff. The staff works with the country to put together a package of lending that the board approves. And what I have seen, and maybe this is more of a personal experience, what maybe didn't happen 10 years ago is that a board member, when we're discussing lending, would say, but what are we doing in the program context to combat corruption, and what are we doing to combat money laundering? You do hear that. I sit sometimes in those board meetings when we're doing lending, and trust me, they do want to make sure that we're also addressing those issues, because if not, the objectives of the program will not be met. So I cannot say it's perfect or wonderful all the time. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, but I do think these considerations are taken in. It's not ignored, even if we don't publish a rating, but we do have some of these assessments internally. I hope that helps. And thank you so much for your questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, thanks so much. Friday, almost 7 p.m. We are all really committed to this agenda. Let me close by asking, please, a big round of applause for our speakers today, and thanks so much for joining us.